Dear students, welcome to Darasa Online. My name is Mr. Darcy, a teacher from Jitegemee Secondary School. I teach English Language 1. The lesson is about language skills. Specifically, we are going to deal with the subtopics of listening and speaking. Dear students, at the end of this session, it is expected that you would be able to describe who is an active listener. And also, you should be able to tell the usefulness of rising and falling of our tone when we are speaking. We are going to make a review of these subtopics by having a leading question that says, how can you describe an active listener? How can you describe an active listener? Before we look at the features that would describe an active listener, let us first of all try to know who is a listener. A listener is a person who receives information or rather sound waves when someone else is speaking. It might be you or any other person, provided he or she receives information. It is a task of a listener to concentrate and pay attention to receive information which is spoken by another person. In this case, I want us to make a small distinction between hearing and listening, because it's not all the time when you receive sound waves or when you receive information that could be listening. Sometimes we receive sound waves or information without paying attention. So it is the receiving of the sound waves unintentionally. That is hearing. Imagine at a situation where you sit somewhere and you hear many people talk from different angles. Since you have not paid attention of what they say, that is said to be hearing. But once you concentrate, you pay attention, you want to receive sound waves from a particular source, that is what we consider it to be listening. So in this case, when we want now to describe an active listener, we have to look at what are the things that this person has to have or has to do for him to be a good listener, or in other words, to be an active listener. The foremost, an active listener should declare the subject is interesting. In this declaration, a person needs to develop interest to what he or she is going to receive. Because otherwise, if you are not interested to what you are going to listen, definitely you will lose concentration of what is going to be spoken. People tends to listen to the things which they like, and they don't want to listen to the things that they don't like. But there are times, under some circumstances, one has to be forced by the situation, and or he or she has to force himself or herself to receive certain information even though he or she doesn't like. In this case, for instance, you are sitting before your teacher as you want to receive certain information depending on which subject that is going to be taught. So whether you like and or you don't like the subject, as long as you are preparing yourself for some examinations, then you need to develop interest on whatever is going to be said. As I have just finished talking about the first point, that an active listener should declare the subject being interesting, but the second is an active listener has to have an attentive face. Has to have an attentive face. When we talk about a person having an attentive face, should be a face which shines, a kind of an appearance that would make a person look like he or she is listening. When you are angry, definitely your concentration will not be on what the speaker is saying. In relation to be having an attentive face, people say an active listener must be attentive. When you're talking about being attentive, it's that it's not only the ears that listen. It is, of course, our face, our eyes, and the mind as well. And in the same case, an active listener must be mentally and physically fit, mentally and physically prepared. All these, they are under an active listener being attentive. You cannot go for listening if you are mentally ill and or if you are physically not prepared. That's very, very important. The next characteristic or feature that describes an active listener is at a point where a listener has to hold the critiques towards the speaker. That an active listener has to hold a critique towards the speaker. That people sometimes tend to criticize the speaker's mannerism of talking. And or they do criticize on the speaker's appearance. Might be the way he or she dresses, and some other peripheral aspects. In this case, remember, your intention is to receive information and not making all those critiques. An active listener should take notes reasonably. You have to take down only some important ideas, the basic facts, that you'll need to remember them in the future. You don't need to write anything that the speaker says, because one may lose the connection of other points, and you might be left behind when the speaker is still talking, if at all you'll be trying to take everything that the speaker says. So in this case, as an active listener, you have to think of what are the important ideas that I should note them down, which in this case, you can identify the important ideas in different ways. It depends on the speaker himself. You know, there are some speakers, when they want to make a point, they'll note it down. So in that case, you have to ask yourself, why has the speaker noted the point down? So definitely, you need to know that is the important fact that I also need to remember. But there are some other speakers, they would use some certain phrases which signal that a person is shifting from one point to another point. These words, we call them linking words. Dear students, another important feature that would make an active listener, or that would describe an active listener, is that he or she has to pay attention from the beginning of the speech or lecture towards the end. In simple language, we say an active listener should not jump to the conclusion.
Sorry.
That an active listener does not jump to the conclusion. As I said before, he or she has to listen from the beginning up to the end. There are some people, or you can even be you students, that as we are like making a revision class here, you might have been told or discussed about these descriptions of an active listener. So having the introductory sentences that the speaker says, then you might find a person say, oh, I know these things already. So in that case, you lose the interest of keeping on listening from the speaker. Additionally, an active listener has to develop willingness. If you are not willing, to listen, it is definitely going to be destructive. You know, I can use an example of you students that sometimes you might be sitting there watching as you're listening. Maybe you're not willing to do that. You are only doing it maybe because your guardian or your parents have asked you or forced you to do that. And so, when you are doing something unwilling, it is very difficult for you to achieve the purpose. So, a person who has to be an active listener must develop willingness. Apart from that, as an active listener, he or she has to create a conducive environment for him when he or she wants to concentrate on something. Just like now, if you are listening while there are noises around, it is difficult for you to concentrate, because you might be interested on some of the other noises. Imagine you are concentrating now and there's a music played around. You might lose your focus and instead concentrating on listening to the nearby music. Above all, an active listener must eat properly and have enough rest. You cannot go for listening if you have hungry mind. You cannot go for listening if you are tired. So make sure you eat and you rest as you are preparing for the task ahead. This point of making a person have a proper eating and resting could make an active listener be attentive throughout the time of listening. With this view, you as a listener, if you want to become among the active listeners, you have to develop this. And with that, will improve your listening skills. On the other hand, we can describe a listener in an opposite way from what we have described here. And if we do that, that listener becomes a poor listener. Or maybe, let us try to look at how can you describe a poor listener? We can describe a poor listener by making these features in an opposite way. For example, so our leading question could be, how can you describe a poor listener? As I said before, that the descriptions that you are going to see, they are like the opposite of what we have already discussed on an active listener. One, a poor listener always tend to declare that the subject is uninteresting. Declares the subject is uninteresting. So if he does so, definitely he will lose the concentration. And as a result, he or she won't be able to follow and or to understand what is communicated. Second, a poor listener pretends to be attentive. A poor listener pretends to be attentive. He or she might pretend by having a direct eye contact with the speaker, while there are some other things going around in his or her mind. Maybe he or she is thinking of something different from what is communicated. At this point, There are some who went far. They can even sometimes try to nod their head as if they are following. But in real sense, they are just pretending. Addition, a poor listener tends to criticize the content of the speech. They tend to criticize the content of the speech. So in all the time that they're listening, they'll try to look at a point where maybe the speaker went wrong. And so from there, he or she can develop his or her argumentation. So if a person or if a listener is looking at areas where the speaker went wrong, so in that case, at the end of the listening session, this person could find himself or herself had captured nothing. Another description of a poor listener. A poor listener criticizes the manners of talking. As we can see, we are different human beings, and therefore we speak differently. There are some, when they speak, they have some speech defect, like maybe one having stammering problem, or any other fault. So what is important here, if you are to be an active listener in this case, what you need to do is to concentrate on the speech, to concentrate on what you want to receive. Don't criticize the speaker's appearance. So a poor listener is the one who in most cases look at the peripheral aspects and not what is spoken. You try to ask yourself, okay, how does the speaker speak? How has he or she combed his or her hair? Maybe you look at the way he or she dresses. Those are things which are not allowed for an active listener. So it is only a poor listener who does all those. A poor listener takes down notes excessively. Takes down notes excessively. He would want to write everything that he receives from the speaker. In that case, this person will obviously lose the connection. Finally, a poor listener always jumps to the conclusion. A poor listener jumps to the conclusion that if it happens that he has heard some introductory sentences or remarks, and maybe it clicks in his or her mind that he has heard them somewhere sometimes, then you say, oh, I know these things. So once you say, oh, I know it, that means you are telling your mind not to keep on concentrating on what is going to be spoken, because you'd say, I know it already. So these are the descriptions that tells who a poor listener looks like, or how does a poor listener looks like. With these descriptions, I'm now sure that you are able to describe yourself as to whether you are an active listener or a poor listener. Or you can even try to tell the next person sitting to you as whether he is an active listener or a poor listener. Thank you very much for listening. I now welcome questioning from you as you were following our lesson. You can ask your question by writing a text message in a WhatsApp using the number which is displayed on your screen. Thank you very much, dear students. Once again, I have received a question from Shabani Idi, from Kigoma. He's asking on how should a listener behaves when listening. How should a listener behaves when listening? This question, it has so far been answered in the descriptions that we have provided. But maybe I may add up some of the other things which they might be missed from this description. One, you could talk about an active listener has to have a comfortable sitting position. That when you are listening, you don't need, or you don't have to sit loose or relaxed as if you're listening to your music. You have to sit correctly. That will show you are paying attention. Also, an active listener has to have a closed mouth smile and direct eye contact. Why do we have to have a direct eye contact? That one can show that the listener is interesting. Imagine you're talking to your friend and he or she doesn't look at you. He's looking somewhere else. Will you keep on talking to him? Definitely, that one might not encourage you to continue speaking. So direct eye contact, it also encourages the speaker to keep on talking. Because in other words, you give him a feedback that you are listening. Above all, direct eye contact, it shows that the listener is interested. Yeah, another description of an active listener is that he or she has to have an occasional head nod. You don't have to nod all the time or throughout your listening, but there's a point when there's what we call aha. So when you catch that, that is when you find a person is nodding his or her head. That's another behavior of an active listener. And lastly, an active listener should not have a distracting body gestures. When I talk about distractive body gestures, they simply mean that maybe the tapping of our foot or the drumming of fingers, covering your mouth, or maybe talking to a person sitting next to you. All those describes the body gestures that describes an active listener. Thank you very much for listening. Dear students, we have finished talking about listening. But when you listen, there must be a person speaking. So you can see the connection on how listening and speaking are. So I want to talk a bit about speaking skills. When we are speaking, we are making different utterances. How should we make them to see which effect could they bring? Because when we write sometimes by using punctuations, marks that allows a person to make an interpretation of what has been written. But in speaking, we are using prosodic features, the meaningful features that a person has to observe when speaking. And this lesson presents to you intonation as one among the features which we have to observe when we are speaking or when we are communicating. Intonation has to do with the rising and the falling of our voice quality. Some other people talk about the rising tone and the falling tone. So we want to see how can we have the rising and the falling tone in our sentences or in our utterances when we speak. Let's look at the following sentences. Yeah, as I said before, that intonation has to do with rising and falling of our voice quality. So when we are communicating, we are making utterances. So these utterances, they have to be said either by rising and or falling. Look at these sentences here. The first one reads, they are listening to the teacher. Where are you coming from? Second one. And the last one is, shut the door. These are different sentences, as you can see. The first one is a statement. The second one is a WH question. And the last one is a command. This is bunch number 1. How do we say them? A statement, under normal circumstances, it is said with the falling tone. You start from high, and as you're going towards the end, you lower down your voice. So we talk about a statement being made with the falling tone. And what about the WH question? Where are you coming from? Where are you coming from? A WH question, it also starts with a rising tone. And so it goes down. And the last sentence, shut the door. Again, this is a command type of a sentence, which it suggests that there is a falling tone. You start from high as you go down. Shut the door. When you look at the other bunch of the sentences, the first one reads, are you a student? Are you a student? So this one is a question, but it's a yes-no question, which when we say it, we have to use the rising tone. And the second one is a request. And how do we say this? May I come in? May I come in? Again, this one goes with the rising tone. The last one is more or less the same as the first one, because it's also a yes-no type of a question. Are you ready? Are you ready? So we say it with a rising tone. So when we are speaking, we need, of course, to observe the rising and the falling tone. Thank you, my dear students, for listening this short presentation. I now welcome you again to ask questions in relation to speaking, if at all you have one. Welcome. Thank you very much, Fatuma Jumanne from Tanga. She has asked a question about rising and falling of our voice quality. The question reads, how is intonation important in our communication? How is intonation important in our communication? Yeah, thank you. Of course, intonation is very useful when people are communicating. And this question can be asked or can be answered by looking at different functions that the intonation performs. So if we may discuss those, we can call them the usefulness of intonation. But as I said, other people call it functions of intonation. The foremost, intonation helps for communication. Some other people in their writings, they call it communicative function. When people communicate, they have to exchange the tenor of their speaking. One speaks and the other one speaks after. But now, how do they give this chance of speaking? It is through intonation that a person can understand whether the speaker has gone towards the end of his time of speaking, and or the speaker still maintains the turn of speaking. By rising tone, it shows the speaker keep on talking, or the speaker holds the turn of speaking. But when you find the speaker fall, that shows finality. So in other words, he allows the next person to come up. That's number one. But number two, intonation helps intonation helps to show or to tell the emotion of the speaker, feelings of the speaker. That, you know, that time we don't need to say, I'm angry or I'm sad. So it is through the rising and the falling of the voice quality will tell whether the speaker is angry or the speaker is sad. By raising the voice unnecessarily when the two communicates, it definitely shows that this person is angry. But when you find the speaker is very down, maybe we can tell he or she is sad. Additionally, it shows the focus of the speaker. In other books, they call it emphatic. It shows emphasis. Where and how does the speaker want the message to be understood? That the same utterance can be said differently so as it could mark different understanding. When you come across, for instance, a sentence like you come across with a sentence like that, I could say it by making my focus on the word Juma. So I could read my sentence like, Juma bought a book. And alternatively, I could say it, Juma bought a book. So my emphasis there again is on bought. And I could say, Juma bought a book. So the focal area will differ depending on where the speaker wants to put an emphasis and on which message does he wants to communicate. And the last usefulness of the intonation, it is for stylistic reason. Stylistic reason. That the aim of communication is to make the two understand one another. And when the speaker say, his or her intention is to make sure that what he or she says is understood. So how do we make our messages delivered? It depends. It is a person might decide to raise his or her voice to draw the attention of the listener, and or another person might decide to lower down his or her voice to make those listeners concentrate much. And so those are the usefulness of intonation. Or in other words, we can say, those are the functions of intonation. Given that we have a short time, we are running short of time, I hope we'll continue to discuss many more other things in relation to English Language 1 in the coming other lessons. Thank you very much for listening.